efficiency, energy sufficiency in buildings, and sustainable urban transition. So a range of topics. And the title of her talk today is Energy Sufficiency in Buildings and Cities, Concepts and Examples. So brilliant. It's going to be really interesting. Anja's going to speak for about 45 minutes and then we'll have questions afterwards. You're quite welcome to put questions in the chat as we go along, and we'll also be getting questions from the room. So let's see how we can make the best of our hybrid event, and over to Anja.
Thank you so much, Tina, and thanks so much for inviting me. Don't be surprised that my camera turns off already. Again, it just works automatically while I'm using Teams via my browser. But I think it's okay, because it's no need that you really see me, but maybe the slides, because I thought about bringing some pictures with me, talking about sufficiency in buildings and cities, because it's always good to see what someone is talking about, so maybe. So yeah, just briefly, for those who do not know the Wupperthal Institute, it's a research institute that takes research mainly for the transition to sustainable development. So we are not only looking at what are the targets, what are the climate goals that we have to reach, but we are mainly interested in the questions, how do we get there? And this is, we are working on all kinds of political levels, from international to EU to national, and as you might suppose, we are working with my research unit on the local level. So we are looking how transitions can be really implemented to a more sustainable means, more ecological, also more socially just, and livable cities. Finally, I'd say this is mainly the goal where we are going to, and we are approaching it. Tina just mentioned it. We're coming right from this, I'd say, more typical approach. We are looking at emissions. We are looking on climate action. We are looking on energy use. And this is a picture abroad, which is the emissions in Germany from 1990 to more or less today. And it's going down, yes, but not really as much as it should be. And interestingly enough, this is the same time range, but this is the energy use in Germany by sectors. And this is exactly what I'm going to talk about when it comes to sufficiency, because we see that the energy use mainly stays on the same and rather high level. So we have some issues here in Germany regarding our climate goals. On the one hand, we have a lack of ambition when it comes to the Paris Agreement. So the concept, the plan, the measures our government implemented was not fulfilling the ambition we need to be Paris, to really go for the Paris Agreement. And then on top of that, we have a lack of implementation. So this is the red areas you see. So we have kind of two aspects lacking in our emission reduction. And one not really irrelevant sector is the building sector. In Germany, it's relevant for almost 40% of the overall energy use, and with that for more than 1/3 of the CO2 emissions. And interestingly, I mean, this is pretty much the graph you saw before. There are hardly any energy savings since 2010. And furthermore, it's not only about counting tons of emission, but also of resources. And the building sector is it's also in that case really relevant, because here is where more than half of the German waste production comes from. Talking not only about CO2 emissions, but also about resources. These are some numbers that yearly are needed for the building sector in Germany. So it's really quite a lot of resources. But there's also another resource which is not really so much in the focus in German politics, I'd say, and this is that we still use around 60 hectares of land per day. This is not what we are talking about, like the others. The other numbers are per year, but this is per day. So we kind of really deconstructing our own goals. They were supposed to be 60% renewables in 2050, and this means really total energy use. You know, we're not talking about only about buildings or mobility, but also about the energy intensive industries and all sectors, really the total energy use. We are talking about reaching an almost climate neutral building stock where we are far away from, and just kind of not brand new, but from the spring, we have the new climate target of being climate neutral by 2045 instead of 2050. But also we have a land use target, and this is actually not only true for Germany, but for the European Union altogether. There's supposed to be net zero land use for settlements in 2050. Means wherever you use new land for settlements, you have to reconstruct and renaturalize other areas. And this is definitely something where we are even further far away from compared to our climate targets. So let's have a little bit a look into different areas to maybe get it more tangible what we are talking about when we're talking about sufficiency and where it comes from that we are not reaching our targets so far. When you look and build at the buildings, of course, you have the chance to implement PV, solar panels, or renewable heating systems. You also can ask, where does my building material come from and which material do I use at all? And also we have, like, this kind of colorful step you see, these different efficiency regulations implemented over the years that really ask for more and more energy efficient buildings. And if you look at it, this efficiency thing works because this is actually what the red line shows. The red line going down is the energy demand per square meter. So this is exactly what you see when we talk about efficiency. Buildings are getting more efficient, but we have another trend at the same time, which is the living space per person, which is constantly going up since the 1960s. And interestingly, it's not only in history, but all projections are showing, are saying this will continue, you know, also in the future. I mean, this is a graph that goes until 2050, and you see the yellow line still going up. And so it comes that this black line, the energy demand per capita, is not really going down at all. And this is exactly what I was talking about when I showed you the graph about the energy demand in Germany overall sectors. And this is exactly true for buildings. So just some brief numbers. I picked not really randomly from 2 years, 2002 and 2016. I picked because based on the statistics, we had exactly pretty much the same number of inhabitants in Germany, 82.5 million. In 2002, we had 38.9 million housing units. In 2016, we had 41.7 million housing units. Interestingly, is in 2002, the political and media were talking about Germany is built. So we are done. You know, the housing markets were okay, and everything was kind of nice and fine. And our former chancellor said Germany is built. 2016, having 500,000 more, quite a million more housing units in Germany, we suddenly have studies that say we have a further need for up to 400,000 units per year. So how does that come? we had a look at some drivers for the living space increase. First of all, we have generally bigger buildings today. So a regular flat, let's say 3 to 4 rooms, or a regular house, today is just bigger than it was maybe in the 1960s or 70s. Maybe we had like children's rooms for like of 10 or 12 square meters. This is nothing you build today anymore, really. So buildings per se became bigger. Then we have, like many industrialized countries, we have more we have this kind of idea that single family buildings, single family houses are a kind of how it is supposed, how we are supposed to live. It's a kind of status symbol, and still, I think 60% or something around that per year say a single family house is where I am heading for my housing in future. And single family buildings on average are also bigger than a similar unit in a multifamily building. So let's say you have a 4-room flat in a multifamily building, and in a single family home with 4 rooms, the square meters are just higher in the single family home. And also something that is pretty much true for many industrialized countries is this trend to smaller households. And smaller households, less person in one living unit, use more space in relation to more persons. I mean, it's an easy thing. If you have 2 person in one household, you share the kitchen, you share the bathroom, you share the corridor, you know, all that. And the more people you have in a household, the more people are there who are sharing specific areas. And of course, the smaller the households get, the less of this kind of shared space is there. And we also a long time had a trend, and it's still supported in regulation, that you have homeowners. So there are less tenants, but more people who own a house. And at least in Germany, it's kind of an average statistics that if you buy something, if you own a house or if you own a flat, you decide to go for some more space, for something bigger in comparison to tenant households. And then we have 3 other effects that kind of intervene. We have an aging effect, which also is shown in the table below. These are like age cohorts. You know, the younger you are, on the less space you live usually. These are not numbers per person, but per household. And then the older you get is like, you know, a lot of explanation behind that. You earn more money. You might want to start a family, and so you move to rather bigger households, to bigger housing units. And then something comes on top of that, the so-called cohort effect, because households today overall use more space than they used to use like 10-20 years ago. So the cohorts in this table, the elderly households, they not necessarily really lived ever in bigger housing units, but the middle-aged cohorts, they are supposed to take these high numbers with them in the higher ages. And then once you started a family, there comes the point, or usually there comes the point where your children move out, and this is where the empty nest effect starts. So we are quite good in moving into bigger households, but we are not used to at all to move back again when the household is shrinking again. So all that together leads to this increase of on living space per person. And of course, this has quite some effects. On the one hand, the environmental effects. I said something about the daily land use for settlements already. And of course, it has an impact on the consumption of energy and resources. But it also is an issue when it comes to the adaptation to climate change, because of course, you know, daily land use and adaptation or land use for settlements, and the question of where do we have green spaces. Of course, there is a conflict. But we also see some social effects. I mean, on the one hand, we surely have the housing shortage in cities, in some German growing cities. And we have especially a shortage of affordable housing. But on the other hand, we also see that not only the affordability is an issue, but also the question, who does live in the bigger houses, in the bigger flats? And these are the typical that I talked about before, the empty nesters, that with aging and lower physical capacity, this what used to be wealth becomes a burden. And if you ask the people in these big houses, in these big flats, there are not that few who say it really is a burden. I would like to change something in my housing situation, but I do not know how. And I do not really have an alternative around here where I want to stay, where I am at home. So what is definitely lacking in our housing stock is housing for elderly people that are not only for whom it is not only a burden living in a too big house, but also they are afraid of being socially isolated when they become elder. So there's definitely some effects that are more on the social side, and they are not only positive. So this increase where we are usually saying, okay, the more the better, you see there is like something like a top of what is really good and where it becomes also too much. And maybe one example I brought from a project we are just finishing. There was a small city in Bavaria, and they had a calculation that they need like 3,000 new housing units until 2030. So we try to identify with them strategies how they could do it mainly resource and land use efficient, and like being sensitive about that. So we modeled 4 kinds of strategy. The one is the vertical densification, which kind of needs more or less no new land. We have the horizontal densification, which means like if you have a single family home, for example, and you want to separate it into 2 units, then it might make sense to have a separate entrance and maybe one room around it or whatever. So this is what we understand under the horizontal densification. And also, of course, if you have like in inner cities, you have land left where you can develop a city more within the built area already. Also, that is what we would call horizontal densification. Then we have the strategy of conversion, which means we have like rather bigger areas, for example, former industrial areas or militarily used areas, and they are changed, they are converted to housing. And then we have the strategy that unfortunately is, I'd say, maybe the strategy that is mainly followed after when it comes to new housing. That's the green meadow. So we really take new land that has not been developed before and build there the housing units. And if you look at these numbers, these are the resources you need for these different developments. From the green meadow, which is the GW baseline scenario, that would mean we build all these new housing units on the green meadow or somewhere on a new land. We also did some baseline scenarios looking at how did urban development was proceeded before. So how much of vertical horizontal densification, how much conversion the city proceeded before. And then we said, okay, could you have some more ambitious goals So that was the resource efficiency scenario, which is the third column here. And then we were looking at the pure vertical densification, just to know, to grasp a little bit the dimensions of resources we need, which is here shown in tons. So the one thing are the resources we need. The other thing I said is the land we need for it. And we do not see the green meadow and not the purely vertical densification here, but the baseline and the resource efficiency scenario, which is a mixture of all the 4 strategies, both. But you see that it's an extreme difference. You know, the baseline scenario is comes close to or more than 31 hectares. And the resource efficiency scenario needs not even 12 hectares. So it's really, it makes sense to look at how you develop your new settlements, and where you can really follow this demand for new housing usage, which is there. But the question, how do I approach this demand, is really, really relevant. So we were looking at some areas for sufficiency in buildings. The one thing, of course, is we can build small. I'm sure you all heard about tiny houses or caravan or container housing or studio flats. We also can build flexible. So this is exactly that would make it more easily to adapt your housing unit to changing biographical periods, like, for example, children moving out. We are also talking about inner development within buildings. How can we more flexibly put units together or separate it again, but also multifunctional planning, because not necessarily all areas are needed privately, and not all functions are needed all day long. You know, so there might also be a room that is in the morning maybe a working space, and in the evening it is used for, I don't know, the birthday party, for example. And of course, we have the shared areas. We have the typical residential homes for special groups, but we also have like co-housing or multi-generational housing, where you have community areas and rooms that you do not necessarily need in your private area. This is all these things you can think about mainly or best when you are building new, but there are also options when it comes to existing buildings. And the one thing is that you can kind of use things less, which is interestingly a topic that 2 years ago I was, of course, I was talking about it, and I said, yeah, we have also virtual rooms, but I never really believed in it, that it is quite some issue. But this changed so dramatically when we have this pandemic. So suddenly this is really something that becomes interesting. So how much of organization like home office or flexible working and virtual rooms can kind of make buildings and rooms be used less. So that's definitely something I completely underestimated a couple of maybe 2 years ago. And of course, also in existing buildings, you can think about flexibility. You can also, and an important thing is, especially when it comes to buildings that are, let's say, underoccupied, either over time or during the day or during the year. So all these kind of things are a question: how flexible can you change users if you do not need it for not anymore? And this can also be true for temporary use. I know, for example, there you can see it in non-residential buildings. Sometimes you have, like in the summer, you have like a little store where which is a cafe or an ice cafe where they sell ice, and in the winter it's something completely else. Let's say maybe they sell clothes there. So all these kinds of things of concepts you also can think on when it comes to flexible use. And of course, you have also here shared areas, shared rooms, and you can think it further even to shared furniture or appliances that you maybe not need every day. So actually, this is we tried to find a definition, and this is what Tina mentioned when we did the energy sufficiency ECEEE project. We thought about how do we get it into kind of one sentence, these area for sufficiency in buildings. So we came up with it's adequate space, thoughtfully constructed and sufficiently equipped for reasonable use. And now you can absolutely argue this is not really something that I can grab really well. But we were also trying to come up with some definitions or quantitative indicators, benchmarks or something. And if you look at it, you already see some approaches to it. For example, you have the EU adequate housing, or in UK, it's the bedroom standard. And we, at least in Germany, have a definition of adequate space for as a regulation for persons who receive housing allowances. So thoughtfully, it means that you, on the one hand, you can look at the material, but it's also how can you, what material, what construction do you use when you need to adapt to changing use and needs? And also, does the material and the construction allow you a deconstruction instead of demolition? So this is what we maybe makes it a little more tangible when it comes to thoughtfully. Sufficiently is something, what do I really need privately, and what can I also maybe share or borrow when I need something. And there are some examples, but I'll come to that later. And reasonable is something that how adaptable is a floor plan, and this is what I try to, yeah, maybe not really very well, but kind of sketch underneath. Pretty easy. If you have a room that you have to cross to come to the second room, this is something that definitely disturbs privacy if you want to live there with two people not being kind of core family, maybe not being a couple. So this is just a very simple example of what we try to understand for designed for reasonable use. So, of course, we have this big issue of residential buildings. Interestingly, we had an online survey in a project we conducted during Corona, and the first, no, I think it was the second lockdown. I don't know exactly, but whatever. So we also asked, what is quality for you? How do you live, and do you perceive it as quality? And did this change under the lockdown? And of course, there were people saying it's really good to have the home on our own, being safe. We do not have to, no danger of getting infected. We have the garden around our house. And of course, that was mentioned quite a lot, at least from those people who actually live in these kinds of houses. But we also had answers who said, well, the building always was too big already, or for quite some years now, and now I completely feel isolated, not being supposed to even invite my neighbor anymore. And on the other hand, we had answers from people living in these apartment buildings, which are not necessarily kind of a good neighborhood. It can be very anonymous living there. And they, on the one hand side, said, it's really annoying because the neighbors are disturbing me. I am afraid that I catch myself a coronavirus somewhere in the corridors or in the elevators. And it was true. I mean, those were these kinds of buildings on the left side. Those were the corona hotspots. But on the other hand, we see multifamily buildings and co-housing projects who said it's a high quality to have people living with me. We have a very good social connection. We can talk from balcony to balcony, and it's very good to know I have someone here who will kind of recognize when I maybe do not feel good. So that's interesting, I think, how you can design and develop social cohesion also, and you can design neighborhood. Of course, you can always have to have a little bit luck with your neighbors, but nevertheless, architecture can do something on top of it to really support it. So the question is, of course, then, do we have a lack of new buildings, or do we have a lack of optimized use? And this is also true when it comes to non-residential buildings. And as I was saying, all these virtual world we all experience for the last 2 years, or almost 2 years now, that's something that is not really foreseeable yet. How many people will continue to work more flexible? Will they go back to their bureau offices again, or maybe will there be less need for bureaus in the upcoming years? This is something that we cannot really say yet, I'd say. But nevertheless, if you have a lack of housing in your city, it's definitely something that makes sense to at least consider as a potential to reuse these buildings that might not be needed anymore in the primary use. And then, of course, it comes to transport, how we live and where we live. It has a lot to do with our mobility choices. And we know that an attractive environment increases the acceptance of longer walking distances, and that is also true for cycling. But looking at the right picture, which I took here in my hometown in Cologne, and it's not like you really have to search for these kinds of situations. You find them quite regularly. So this is not where a campaign saying, do not drive your car, use your bike, really work. I mean, I can understand everyone who says this is definitely too dangerous for me to cycle here. And this is, and when you put both together, then you are very much in front of the quality around your, or the nearer area, your neighborhood, the quality you find outside in front of your door. And it is interesting because also that was mentioned quite often in the survey we did, what changed under the lockdown and under the housing under Corona. And people said that they value very much if they have green spaces nearby, or really in front of their house, or in front of their flat. And this is a project we did, or we are still doing actually. And this was a visualization for this city you see in the first picture. And then we did 3 versions, which are pretty much 50% less parking space in the street, 75, and no parking in the street anymore. And we asked the people living in the street, and they voted for their favorite, and 2 and 3 really got the highest ranks. But then we did like an interim closing of the street, and we were putting out roll turf and play stuff for children. So it was kind that the neighbors could experience how it might look in the future, the street. And interestingly enough, there was some people, well, a lot of people enjoyed it a lot and enjoyed the new quality, but there were also people complaining and saying, I had my parking space in front of the door for 20 years and now you want to take it away. So it took me, what I took from it was, I think these nice visions we develop, that's also quite neat, I mean, they are very clean, these streets, they are very neat. I don't know how long they are going to look like that, but these are visions we can kind of call, we all find a kind of good, but this is exactly when it comes to the transitions, the first step, the second step, they might bear the conflicts. But also when you look into the cities, even I'm going from the small scale to the broader scale. I find it extremely interesting. I don't know how it was in the UK, but here we had so many articles talking during the lockdown about empty city centers. And we also had a lot of articles talking about overcrowded parks. But I never read an article asking why is it like that? So what makes people not going into the city center? I mean, of course, we know why we do not want to approach city centers then, because they do not have any kind of comfort or quality just to stay there. All they have is this very monofunctional consumption situation, and this is true for I'd say for many bigger cities, and not only in Germany but worldwide. But I then talked to a city called Regensburg, which is also Bavaria, or is it Baden-Württemberg? I'm so, what a shame. I don't know exactly. But it was interesting because they said, well, people go to the city center here. So I asked, so, but how's that? How is, because I didn't know the city center of Regensburg. And they said, well, they have a child-friendly planning strategy for years already. So they are really trying to make the city a child-friendly and a livable area for children. So they have like all these kind of small recreational areas in the city center. They have like small playgrounds there. And people went there during the lockdown and went to the city center just to be there, like other people finding this quality in parks, which I found really interesting. And yeah, maybe one example that I found really interesting. This is not Germany, this is Switzerland. It's a co-housing project for 1,300 people. They are living in 13 buildings. They are built new, which is a little bit of a pity, but nevertheless, at least it is an old industrial area. So, and it was developed completely newly. And they really did quite some of these aspects that I try to explain here, that that quality is not necessarily only quantity, because they have all kinds of different housing concepts implemented here. So you can choose from really very regular studio apartments to 1, 2, 3 room flats, but also to like satellite housing. So you have like very small private areas around a bigger shared area where like 10 or 12 people, I think, share these areas. Like this is on the left side is one of these of the kitchens. And what I found also interesting, none of the flats in this area has a washing machine, but they only have like these areas where you have the washing machine where you go to do your laundry. And also for these 1,300 people, I think they have 80 parking spaces, while 40 of them are reserved for people doing their businesses in this area. And some others are reserved for elderly people. And there is also a co-housing project for handicapped people. So these are the ones who these parking spaces are reserved for. And for the others, you have this mobility station where you can borrow pretty much everything you can imagine. You can borrow bicycles, but also electric bicycles and all kinds of. They are also cooperating with the car sharing initiative in Zurich. So you cannot pretty much have each vehicle you need, but you do not own it. And interestingly is that they also have a guest house, because you are not supposed to have more than uh, how is it? Let me think. It's like the number of people in your household plus one room, I think. So people go there. If they move there, they agree to change their housing unit. If, let's say, for example, I'll make it easy. I move in with my partner, and then we split. And we had like a 3 room flat. We split. I stay there on my own, so I have kind of options. I either find really fast a new partner, or I sublet one of the rooms, or I move out. So this is what you have to know when you move there. But all this organization is managed via the reception of the guest house. And the guest house is there because you not necessarily have much space for guests. So if you are expecting guests, you can temporarily rent a guest room in this house. So they have all these kinds of, how I think, really interesting approaches how to lower the floor area per person. So now, how to address sufficiency in buildings and urban development. This is just really a very small and kind of random selection of quite some ideas we developed further. But nevertheless, I think one thing is a living space moratorium would be really, really helpful, because the point is that not only growing cities are developing new settlements, but also shrinking cities, because they think once they have like the new settlement with nice single family homes, the young families will think about it and go to their city again. So this is something that unfortunately happens everywhere. So if you are growing, the strategy to deal with it is new settlements. If you're shrinking, the idea to deal with it is new settlements. So this is a kind of yeah, strange maybe, but that's how it is. So I think living space moratorium means you are only allowed to develop new land when you are really a growing area. And of course, there are options to link sufficiency to buildings energy regulations. And one thing that I think we do not need at all anymore is parking space regulation that defines how many parking spaces you have to build when you build a house or a bureau building or a shopping mall or whatever. Then you also have, of course, some financial options. You could support moving. You could also have, this is something that we are trying with housing companies, like a rental fee guarantee, because one thing you often see, if you have like 30 years of a stable rent, of a stable rental fee, and then you want to change and you move into a new flat, it might be that it is, let's say, 30, 40 square meters smaller, but even more expensive. But if you have a housing company owning all kinds of flats, then you could support it and say, okay, you take your cheap rent, your rental fee, and you go to the smaller flat, and I even support it. But you as a company can rent out the bigger flat. And we are actually talking to the KfW Bank for developing support programs for yeah, all these kinds of sufficiency in buildings, for density, community buildings, change of use of buildings, etc. And of course, you can do some PR. You need to kind of get the word out what you can do. So you can, for example, advertise flat exchange. You can also think about energy advice or campaigns. Think, you know, adopting sufficiency on these energy advices. And which is also very interesting is if you do competition and pilot projects and you leave the idea to, for example, co-housing initiatives, you sometimes get really, really interesting and extremely creative answers to some difficult areas and some difficult aspects. So this may be some ideas how it can be implemented. And as far as I know, this is my last slide. So I hope I kept the time, kind of. And I say thank you, and I'm looking forward to some questions and discussion.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Anja. That was such a wide-ranging survey of all sorts of issues around buildings and sufficiency, and obviously not just about energy, and very interesting your focus on space and use of new land, because that's contentious everywhere, and we see it, well, particularly locally in Oxford and Oxfordshire. It's a constant debate about the use of sensitive land, of green space, to build new housing. So I'm sure that's quite a universal experience, and again, locally we're seeing a lot of debate about what are called low traffic neighbourhoods, and the idea of reducing traffic brings up all sorts of conflicts, as you say, about where am I going to park my car. And we know it's, in practice change is difficult for all of us, and but you seem to be finding some sort of constructive ways through for that. I would just like to ask, is there anybody, I'm not seeing any questions on the text at the moment, but Robin, are you able to handle questions in the room?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. Can I just check, is anyone a question in the room you'd like to put to the speaker? May I just ask one on behalf of the audience here, which is linking back to energy use. Can we see how more effective use of the space will help accelerate the delivery of energy efficiency measures?
Sorry, it was disturbing a little bit. Could you repeat your question? Sorry.
Sorry, I was just asking on behalf of the room, can we see how more effective use of the living space can work hand in hand with energy efficiency measures to reduce more rapidly the energy consumption?
Yeah, of course. Well, it is one, actually it's one of these things we are talking about. If you have to do something on your house, do it right. It doesn't matter if you want to paint the facade, then you should think about energy efficiency and some insulation. And same is true, for example, when it comes to barrier-free retrofit. And we found a woman during a project we are doing right now, who is actually an energy advisor, but she is for many, many years, when she does energy advice, she comes to people, they have like single family homes, or maybe they have 3, 4, 5 family homes, rather than smaller private landlords. So she is asking them, if you are using this house now like this, how do you think you're going to live in 10 or 20 years? Is there something you should think about? Like, for example, if you want to separate it into 2 units, it might make sense to think now about a second entrance. So maybe we do not just replace a window, but we make a second entrance from it, or something that could be a second. And all this, it's sometimes really rather the little things you can do, at least when it comes to the building stock. But this is something where we can see that efficiency and sufficiency advice can go together very well. And of course, it's also something that's rather, well, that's also linking direction consistency when it comes to circular economy and things. But when you look at resources and the question, how do we construct buildings right now? I said we are having more than half of our waste is coming from the building sector, but it's really difficult, and there is hardly really a lot of that can be recycled into kind of qualitative product again. So quite a lot of that will just be landfill under the next Autobahn or something. So also, that's also something where we can definitely link building regulations, efficiency regulations for buildings with resources. I guess that's something I think is lacking.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Tina, do you want to pick up questions from the chat at this point?
Okay, I think I can ask the people who've asked the questions to put their camera on and ask in person. So Nick Jelly had a question. Nick, do you want to switch on your mic and camera?
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk a lot, actually. But and obviously using the buildings much more efficiently will save a lot of energy. But how do you see the carbon footprint of buildings being reduced? You didn't actually talk about. Just mentioned retrofitting. You didn't mention the importance, say, of heat pumps or even hydrogen. How do you see what's happening in Germany in that area?
Yeah, the point where I didn't talk about heat pumps and hydrogen at the moment, because this is something that I would say is, compared to sufficiency, very well established already. Definitely lacking and not going fast enough, but nevertheless, this is also, I mean, if we look at, let's say, the rate of really energy efficient renovation, and not only talking about insulation, but also, you know, all the kind of changing heating systems, etc. We are around about at 1% per year, which is not really enough. So we will need kind of 100 years to really go through the building stock at all, in you know, to be really completely kind of climate neutral. And even then, you know, in that we're assuming the 1% that this is kind of real deep retrofit. But of course, we see that some of the retrofits are not kind of really deep enough. So this is actually the point. And it's not only about the question of what kind of energy I use or how efficient my home is, but the point that is lacking, and that is what I was talking about, the carbon footprint of a building reduces that you have all this gray energy. You know, you have the material built already, you have the energy used already for the building. And if you kind of get buildings more intensively used by more people, or by over more time, then it reduces the new buildings. And you can of course build, let's say, a plus energy house next to 3 empty buildings, but this is also needing energy and resources, you know. So this is not how we can approach really climate neutrality in the building sector.
No, and that's a very good point. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think the next question is from, says Dave, Seamus. I'm sorry, I don't know what name to call you, but the Oxfordshire County Council had a question. Yeah, I just wondering that when you reduce space, like you're living in a bigger house and then you move to a smaller space, then what? I mean, there are some going to be impact. You know, people find it difficult to leave. And how have you ever tried, or somebody has tried to measure this?
Yeah, they do actually. This is a project that is, in my eyes, very well evaluated, because it was a kind of pilot project. I don't know if you know the Swiss climate targets. They do not have these XYZ% reduction of emission, but they have this absolute target of a 2000 watt society. So they came, and I think it is because they are using this absolute number. You know, they are not kind of in relation to, which is always kind of fuzzy, but they have an absolute number, and this is why they started to think about sufficiency really early. You know, they started this whole discussion, I'd say maybe 10 up to, not the discussion, but to pick it up and to implement things like that. And this is a project that was that tried to really build this new neighborhood, reaching this 2000 watt society target. And it is very well evaluated, because they want to see, do we really reach it? But they also have like very drastic social targets, like they want to have like a picture or a mirror of the Zurich society there. So it's also, they have a lot of affordable housing there. But they also support you very well. You know, it's not like you have to leave your flat. They are supporting you with finding solutions, but they also help you. You know, they're not chasing you out of the Hunziker area, but you can change inside your neighborhood. But they also have like rooms you can, you know, temporarily take for, let's say, 2 years, 3 years while you need it, and then give it back again. You know, for example, let's say your sister moves in for an apprenticeship, and then you can have this extra room, and then you can give it away again to your neighbor or whatever. So
interesting. Thank you.
So I think Robin's going to introduce a question from the room now.
Tina, can I just ask Gavin Killett to come up and put the question himself?
Hello, Anja. Can you see me? I'm a bit shadowy. Thank you for your talk. I want to ask you a little bit about who decides what is reasonable. You talked a lot about sufficiency, and the discussions I've heard with people before, it's actually even difficult to decide what is excessive. But what is enough? How much is enough, and who gets to decide? And how do you get people to agree to go along with that?
it's a very good question. That's what I expected from you. No, but honestly, I know that let's go back to Switzerland once more. They have like sufficiency scenarios where they are dealing with 30 square meter or 35 square meter per person. These are the two approaches actually we also picked for our ECEEE sufficiency paper on buildings. And, you know, that does not necessarily mean that each and every person is supposed to live on 30 or 35 square meters. But the point is that that's something that in average might work quite well and might be a quite good quality for many people. You know, this is exactly what they are doing in the Hunziker Areal project. It's not like they are all living on 35 or 32 square meters, I think it's per person, but it's an average, you know. So there are, of course, people living on small square meters and others on smaller. For example, the people in these satellite co-housing projects, they use less square meter per person than the ones in the more regular 3-room flats. And we also have like these charities for the handicapped people. There are student homes, you know, and in this average, they are approaching the 32 square meters, I think it's per person. I wouldn't say that there is a real number what is enough. I know enough from, you know, from the low side. Let's use maybe Kate Raworth's donut. You know, we know kind of what is too much, but what is really the basic limit. This is nothing I would dare to tell someone. But what we do see is that we have people who are not, for whom it is not quality anymore, you know, where the too much becomes a burden. And suddenly we do not have, you know, in the donut we have outside, we have the economical boundaries, but suddenly we have obviously also social boundaries on the outside. You know, because it is too much. They over exaggerate what they are supposed to use. It's too much, but on the other and at the same time, it's not quality anymore. So these are the people that I think should be approached first. And interestingly, when we look at these very few surveys there are on that, there are 20 to 30% people saying, I could imagine to live differently and also on less space, but I do not have really the alternative. I'd like to stay in my home and I don't know how to do it. Or I would like to, and we had responses of 50% saying we are interested in co-housing, but there is nothing around here. So I think, let's start with these people who are easy to approach, who have the wish already. And then we are also having on the, let's say, maybe on the other side of the scale, we are working with the housing companies. And these are not necessarily, it's municipal housing companies, and the people who live there are not necessarily the ones with the highest carbon footprint, and not with the highest square meter per person. But nevertheless, you also find there people, let's say, the elderly widow in a 3-room flat on the 4th floor without an elevator. So this is quite typical because these settlements are not necessarily in best shape. So also these people are saying, I'd like to live on the ground floor and maybe a little smaller. And then we also found people who say, I need more space. I have, let's say, let's say 4 people in a 3 or 4 room flat. And so we are looking at, is there a possibility to really exchange things? But we are also looking, what can the company provide on like shared areas and shared services that can expand a little the density in your housing unit. So if it is too small at home, what can I offer in the neighborhood to kind of relax the tension inside? This is also something that we want to tackle, on this lower level of housing area. Because for me, sufficiency policy is both, on the one hand, lowering overconsumption, but on the other hand, sufficiency is not only not enough, but it's also, it should be enough, so sufficiency policy I think should address both. I don't know if that was an answer, actually.
We've had a thumbs up from Gavin, so thank you very much. Tina, do you have any other questions you'd like?
Well, actually, there's a question I wanted to ask, which was about cultural context, because if we look at average square meters per person across the EU, it varies hugely, actually, by country. And I think the UK is about one of the lowest per square, per person square meters, and other countries like Denmark have a lot more space. And clearly there's all sorts of things going on there about geography and history and etc. But I was just wondering if you think, is there anything particular about Germany that could make this idea more or less acceptable compared, say, with the Swiss experiment that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I found it really interesting because when I came back, I visited this Hunziker areal once for a couple of days, and I spoke to a couple of people there and so on. And then I came back and I talked to my daughter. I think she was maybe 16 then or something. And I told her about the common laundry rooms. And she was like, but I don't want our neighbors to see my underwear. So I found it so interesting because I did not even think about it. And in the Swiss housing market, this is not specifically this sufficiency project. This is quite regular. I think they said something like 50% of all multifamily houses have these common laundry rooms in the house. It's not really, and compared to that, I think, I don't know how many people in Germany, how many households have their own washing machine. Maybe 80 or 90%, I'd say, just a guess. But so I found it really interesting. What I also find interesting is that we have some projects which are maybe a little comparable to the Swiss project. And I just see on the one hand, I think there is a growing number of interested people in these kinds of co-housing projects, because they kind of appreciate this solidarity, the exchange, this kind of community feeling. On the other hand, you have, let's say, maybe from the 1,300 people there, you have like maybe 200 really actively involved in developing this community areas and doing things together and, planning the summer festival or whatever, And I think this is kind of regular number. You do not kind of activate all the people, but the others are kind of happy that they have found affordable housing, so it's fine. I think it's not really that like you have to motivate each and every person to engage really in this community, but if they still report in the surveys that they appreciate a higher quality. So it's the one that are really active appreciate it because they can engage, and the others appreciate because they are left alone, which sometimes also is a quality. So yeah, so I think this is a kind of role model that works also very well in Germany. Not necessarily all of them are heading for really lowering the floor area per person. So you also see projects like that who are quite excessive. But yeah.
But that's interesting because it's a sort of social transformation as well as an environmental transformation, which you were linking earlier in your talk as well, that it's not one or the other. It's both things are happening, and that's giving a good result, which is great. I'm not seeing any more questions online. Robin, are there any more in the room?
I think we're all trying to absorb all that's happened, so no, there's nothing else happening here either. Thank you.
Okay, well, I guess we should say thanks once again to Anja. Thanks for a really stimulating talk and for giving us some really positive visions of way ahead. And yeah, thanks very much for your time. Robin, do you want to plug next week's or the next talk?
Exactly, yes. Thank you again, Anja and Tina, for hosting. It's an interesting arrangement having people both online speaking and hosting. Just a quick heads up, it will actually be Gavin Killip, we saw just briefly, next week joining us in another hybrid meeting. Gavin, I believe, will be here in person, but you're welcome to register to join online or in person, whichever you prefer. And he'll be talking really about